First and foremost, I'm a VR nerd. I'm a design director over at Studios, where we do CG interactive experiences as well as 360 live action video. So we work with a lot of clients like Bjork, like Coldplay, Denver Broncos, NBC Universal, and produce a wide range of content, and that's where a lot of this sort of learning comes from. But before we get too far as well, I want to give a big shout out to all of these people because they've all played a huge role in my understanding of VR, and they've all posted a lot of really great content. So if you're curious to learn more, I would highly recommend checking out some of the work that they've done. There's a lot of great articles out there. So first and foremost, like, what is VR UX? The kind of UX in general, I feel like if you ask 10 people, you get like 10 different answers or 8 different answers, and they always usually look like a big chart like this that doesn't really make any sense to anybody. So I'm going to try to simplify it into like 4 main principles that I think that apply to VR. I'm sure there's stuff that's going to get left out of there. If you're really upset about something, then we can talk about it. But sort of the first 3, comfort, usability, sort of space and environment, sort of the aesthetic version of it, I feel like all of those principles are pretty strongly rooted in a lot of sort of mobile and web existing design. The last one there, presence, I feel like is something that's kind of new. So I'd like to kind of run through the first couple a little bit faster and spend some more time talking about presence and why I think that's important. But okay, comfort, number 1, like don't make me sick. There's not a lot of sort of like web mobile experiences that make you actually want to throw up. Don't take that as a challenge. The internet's kind of a weird place. I'm sure if you want to find something, you can. But VR in general sort of has that ability right out the bat, particularly if you're not being very careful with it. So the number 1 rule that you have to sort of abide by is like keeping frame rates really high. Making sure that you're tracking, you're like head tracking, you're not dropping frames and things like that. I'm not sure how much experience people have with VR already, so maybe I'm getting a little bit too detailed, but yeah, all right. Basically, hardware, there's a lot of rendering that has to happen, so it's really hard on the GPU. You want to try to keep frame rates above 60, above 90 for Oculus and Vive, and really don't want to compromise on that stuff. But a good place to start, just from like a sort of experience level, things like moving with constant velocity. If I'm in a train car without any windows and I'm moving 10 miles an hour or 1,000 miles an hour, my body can't actually tell the difference, but it can tell accelerations instantly. So that exerts a force on me. If I'm speeding up, slowing down, turning, whatever, my body feels that. And if I see something happen in VR that I expect to feel in my body, and I don't, that starts to create this disconnect between my brain and sort of like all the balance that happens in my ears in different places. And the caveman part of my brain says, hey Christian, weird things are happening in your vision. You probably ate something that's poisonous. I'm going to make you throw that up so that you aren't going to die. And that's kind of what makes you really sick in VR. And so things like avoiding those sort of accelerations is generally a good rule of thumb. Also things like keeping the user grounded. That doesn't necessarily mean keeping them on the ground, but if I'm in something like an airplane, I'm flying around, and I'm doing all sorts of like barrel rolls or something, that can make me really sick if I don't have sort of like a cockpit that stays fixed to my body. And so if I'm going to do all these sort of complex maneuvers or something like that, or accelerations, having something that stays constant to what I'm doing the whole time can be a really helpful tool. Also keeping things at a safe distance. So general rule of thumb is sort of like anything within like 1.5 meters to me makes my eyes, I need to exert muscles to focus them a little bit more carefully in VR just because of where they're naturally converging. So that's totally fine. You can do that sort of in short periods of time. You can do that once in a while. And it's a really great way to get that sort of sense of depth that VR is so fun for. But if I'm doing that repeatedly and doing that for really long periods of time, it can sort of wear out my eyes and make them sore. Also, if I get anything sort of within like half a meter, start to go a little bit cross-eyed, and that's not super fun. You start to see sort of like double images. So sort of anything between 0.5 and 1.5 for a little bit of time, and then anything beyond that is pretty comfortable. Yeah, so how does all this stuff work? There's like a million devices out there, and everybody's got a new technology or a new type of input. And they all have different button mappings from one experience to the other. So how do you keep all this stuff straight as a designer? How do you help the user understand what's going on? There's a lot of hand-holding, and it's like as a developer, you're kind of the worst tester around. You never really know. So testing a lot with people, but also being unbelievably obvious. Like if I have a button I'm supposed to push in space, if I have something on a controller, big text, animated text, arrows. Like, don't be shy about making it like unbelievably obvious. Like, hey, this is the button you need to push. No, it's right here. No, but seriously, it's right here. No, push this button. This is what you need to do. I don't think we're going to be like that forever, but again, as like before standards develop and while we're still sort of like figuring out what really works for people, there's a lot of that kind of thing. So doing that sort of stuff and really testing it. Also, if I'm doing something that's like totally gaze-based, making sure I have like a reticle, like some sort of target, so I know what I'm actually looking at. It can be really frustrating to try to push a button or something that I have to be looking straight at, because I feel like I'm looking straight at it, but it's like the computer doesn't feel like it. So having like a reticle that tells you exactly where that is helpful. Also, just making sure if I don't assume that your user is going to be in like a spinning chair. So if I'm seated, putting something really important behind me can be pretty uncomfortable. Just keeping that in mind. 55 degrees left and right is kind of the general like, working range that seems to be pretty comfortable. And type legibility. The display resolutions are still, they're not what we're used to, so they're not like retina level. So big type using NT-aliasing, that stuff is really important. So the other big part of this is just user testing. You know, like we're in this together. Again, I just mentioned as a developer, you have no idea what the normal user thinks about something. We also run into a challenge with VR that it's so new that new users are kind of just blown away, and everyone's really excited, and everyone's like, oh my god, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. And that's not super useful feedback either. So we're trying to kind of get over that hump. Finding people that are familiar with it, but also not so jaded from spending all day working on it is a big challenge. If you're interested in user research, VR is an amazing opportunity right now. There's so much that has to be learned and so much that has to be figured out that you don't understand until you test it. The other part, so you're in this new environment, you're in a 3D world, and right now a lot of people were just sort of porting 2D flat UI designs into a 3D environment, and that's not sort of like super compelling yet. I understand, I mean I do it too, I think we have to have a question to start from. It's just really important to keep questioning when you're doing that stuff, like, is this existing design, does this make sense in VR, could this be better, like how can I take advantage of the space? Am I just egregiously taking advantage of space and putting things around you because I can, even though it doesn't make sense? Again, circling back and testing that sort of stuff, like trying lots of new things, but also basing it in user research. So experimentation is super important. Just try to be really mindful of it. We're all figuring it out. Some of the other pieces, guiding users. This is really important for like narrative storytelling. Particularly, you don't have a frame anymore that I can control really carefully what you're looking at. There's some piece of like really important dialogue that's happening over here. I don't know that my user isn't kind of like checking out like what's going on over this way. So that can be really frustrating if you're trying to tell a story the way traditional film has always told stories. We either need to start building affordances that direct their attention back their way inherently, or we need to start sort of rethinking dialogue in general. Both, I think, have a lot of opportunity. The other piece is sort of like the environment, where we've got to think a lot more like an architect about this space, a little bit less like sort of a graphic designer. Alex Chu talks a lot about sort of how the experience is dictated by the environment, and I think a really good example of that was an art gallery. An art gallery, lots of them tend to have very similar sort of design, and they're all very well optimized for looking at art. If I look at art in sort of a subway, I have a drastically different impression of what it means and take away from that. And that's sort of like one small example in a world of examples. So thinking how the space that you're in sort of like inspires the work that you're trying to do. Also, yeah, I mentioned like not just sort of being egregious about space because you can. Try new things, but don't put them there just because you can. So this is what I want to get to really is presence and this idea of being there. What does presence mean? It's physically being there, surprise. But I think a good analogy is sort of like believing the myth that designers and developers have created in this virtual world. And so everything that reinforces this idea that I'm in that space, that I'm doing those things, that contributes to presence, and that's really powerful. And what's sort of like so powerful about it, we're seeing a lot of really impressive things around sort of health and safety, particularly curing phobias, curing PTSD, putting people in traumatic experiences in a very safe way, but very heavily controlled by a doctor, by a designer. We're seeing lots of great steps in that direction. I think that the mental health industry in general is on the verge of a major revolution because of the power that VR has. Also empathy. I I mean, there's not a stronger tool, I think, to put someone in someone else's shoes than really convincing them that they're in their shoes. This is footage that was shot immediately following the Nepal earthquake by this VR journalism company called Riot. And their whole company mandate is they want calls with action. So they say, here's a news story, here's how you get involved. I can't think of a better way to get people involved than putting them on the ground in the scene of this earthquake, seeing just the devastation, being surrounded by it. There's no movie magic that can sort of like make this scene look any better or worse than it is. This is the real world, and these are the people, and it's just an amazing way to sort of put yourself in their position. Another one I really want to talk about, because I think it gets a lot of criticism, is I say freedom. A lot of people think of VR as this sort of like escapist, it pulls you out of reality. It's a really negative thing for society, but I don't think that it's inherently good or bad. I think it can be used for different ways. And in particular, the Balboa Foundation is an organization that is bringing VR to hospitalized patients, people with severe illnesses. They can't leave the hospital. They have triple pane glass in their windows, so they can't even hear the outside world. VR is a tool that can help them be in a park for a day, listen to birds, see people playing, interact with people. This is a whole new tool to get you out of this like hospital prison that you can't escape otherwise. I think there's some real potential as well for things like prison systems, for all sorts of different stuff. So how do we do this? How do we sort of create this like magical experience of VR? I like to think there's sort of like two main principles. And that's sort of this idea of agency and interactivity and sort of like context. Agency is all about being able to interact with the world. So I think this is more important than sort of the visual fidelity, because if I have, say, like this water bottle and I pick it up and I throw it around and it responds with physics the way I expect it to, and I can knock it around like an object, that to me feels a lot more real than if it's like beautifully rendered and I can see all the refraction coming off this bottle, but when I touch it, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't sound like anything. So this idea of interactivity is super important for kind of pulling you into that experience. Also the idea of context. There's a lot of constraints to VR right now. You can't move that far, or it's tethered, or there are rendering issues, so you can't produce whatever crazy experience you can imagine. And so working around those sort of things and creating situations where those constraints apply in the real world is a really powerful way to sort of make them disappear altogether. I'm not thinking about them if they make sense. So a few tools as well for kind of encouraging this idea of presence. It really comes back to a lot of sort of like caveman psychology, like things like orienting response. If I see movement, I'm trained to kind of stop what I'm doing, watch that, like fight or flight. Do I want to stand my ground? Do I want to like run away from this? Do I just want to keep an eye on it? In any event, it's taking a lot of my cognitive load that was previously going toward being like, light kind of looks weird on here, or like, that's not like super real. But if I'm thinking about something else, like all my focus is on that. And it's the same thing for like heights, danger zones, anything that provokes that sort of alert system is really great for making you forget about everything else. Distraction, things like the time pressure. If I'm given an activity that I have to do in a short period of time, that really encourages me to focus on that activity. Avoiding things like the uncanny valley, so people that like look kind of realistic but aren't quite realistic. We spend a lot of time looking at each other, and particularly their faces, and so when their eyes or their mouth or things like that don't move the way we expect them to, we kind of dismiss the whole thing as fake. But if I'm interacting with like a robot or a monster or any other crazy thing you can think of, I don't have such a strong opinion about how those things interact, and so I'm a lot more open to those sort of suggestions. And then things like beauty, wonder, fear, any of the sort of like emotional connections are really powerful for, again, pulling me in. I think I'm running over time here, so I just want to talk real quick. Like the reason this is so valuable is because now we can create tools, we can create experiences that delight users in a whole new way, but also they function better. So anytime anyone can benefit from having an actual person there, can be really powerful. Like telecommunication is sort of like the easiest no-brainer for this, but there's like a million other use cases, whether it's education, learning a new language, like teaching, like exercise, any of that sort of stuff. Like we're very social creatures and we benefit tremendously from like being there. So that's kind of most part of what I got here. Love to have any questions if you want to talk. Like I'm always happy to talk about more of this stuff anytime.
Awesome. So we have time for like 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Anybody?